Welcome back, folks, to episode 21 of the RF Factor with Bob Scales. Pete, welcome back, my friend. I know you've
Yeah,
you took a little time off here, but you're
it's been a
back.
while. I know. I've been playing hooky, but I'm
Yeah.
glad to be back. Glad to be back, and I hope Bob appreciates me coming back. And
Yeah. Well, y- are you purposely doing that with the sun in the background to show how San Diego
no,
is
you
so
know what?
beautiful and sunny?
It's I've got a window that's up high. It's a small little window, and there's no blind or anything on it. And it's just the time of day, the time of year, and that sun is going to go away in a minute. So don't worry about it.
Yeah, well, not here. The time of year here is a little cold, but um, hey, Bob, I'm excited to have you on. We're very fortunate that we have a lot of guests, listeners, that reach out to us and say, "Hey, you want to get this guy or this gal on the show?" And you're one of those people that were recommended. When they recommended you, I went into your sort of your social media on LinkedIn, and I started reading some of the stuff that you've written and that you post about police reform, about understanding data, about how data is critical for police reform. And your background on this material is impeccable as well. So I thought it'd be great to have you on. So welcome
Yeah, well,
aboard.
well, thanks for having me. I recently started. I'm not a big social media guy, but I recently started just sort of posting my thoughts on things that came across my news feed and everything, and it's been quite fun, and a lot of people seem to appreciate it because not too many people are sort of talking about the issues that I am. So
Yeah, well,
it's
that's
it's
that's
it's been great.
it's a good thing. So tell us a little bit about yourself, particularly on how you've gotten here as it relates to police reform and data analysis.
Sure. So I was a prosecutor in King County, Washington in the 1990s, and I worked on a number of different interesting projects, including a gun violence crime reduction program and a juvenile firearm crime program. And I switched to the Seattle mayor's office in 2000 and worked as a public safety policy advisor for 14 years for several mayors. And then I switched to the city attorney's office in Seattle, and I was there when the uh, Department of Justice came in 2011 and did their pattern of practice investigation that led to the consent decree that the department's still under. And the mayor appointed me to be the compliance coordinator to oversee the reforms in the department at the beginning of the consent decree.
Hey
And
Bob, just can I just interrupt you one
sure,
second? I'm very familiar with the pattern and practice, the phrase and the understanding, but maybe you can just explain just pattern and practice. And sorry to interrupt you, but I think that's worthy of just describing for a second.
sure. So in, I believe it was about 1994, Congress passed a statute that gave the Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division the authority to investigate local and state law enforcement agencies for a what they call a pattern or practice of unconstitutional policing. And so the Department of Justice can go after individual officers for civil rights violations, but this new statute gave them the authority to actually go after the department if they did an investigation and found that the department had policies or training that essentially created a systemic environment of unconstitutional policing. So, and if the Department of Justice found a pattern or practice, then they had the authority to um, uh, uh, essentially leverage to convince the local jurisdiction to enter into what's called a consent decree, which really isn't a consent decree. It's more of an imposed decree. But basically, the under threat of litigation, the local jurisdiction would agree to go under this decree that would be overseen by a federal judge and a federal monitor and the DOJ. And they would have an agreement between DOJ and the agency on a long list of reforms that had to be implemented, and then what compliance would look like, and then it would be up to the judge and the monitor to determine whether or not the department had met compliance. And so Seattle started theirs in 2012, and they're still under the consent decree, which will go on probably for at least another 5 years, because they have to have full and effective compliance for 2 years before they can get out of it. And which is typical, because these decrees, I mean, I have a lot of opinions about the decrees, but generally they don't lead to the kinds of reform that people are looking for, and they tend to be extremely expensive and incredibly bureaucratic, and they lead to more problems than they actually find solutions. So, but that is sort of the process.
And they start out as an offer you can't refuse, right?
Yeah, there's only one, as far as I know, there's only one jurisdiction that's ever said no, and that was the Alamance County, North Carolina Sheriff's Office. And the Department of Justice did a pattern of practice investigation, and they found, I think it could have been the racial bias, or they found some, could have been use of force, but they found a pattern of practice in some aspect of their policing practices. And they said, DOJ said, you have to enter into a consent decree. And the sheriff, it's a little easier for sheriffs because they're separately elected. So the sheriff said no. And so, because he said no, the Department of Justice had no choice, if they wanted to pursue this, except to take them to federal court, and they did. And the federal government failed to prove that there was, in fact, a pattern of practice.
Wow.
And so the DOJ appealed, but then during the appeal process, they basically worked out a deal with the sheriff that said, if you just agree to do some of these things, then we'll drop our appeal. And of course, the sheriff agreed, and that was it. But the interesting thing is that there have been, probably about 70 or 80 consent decrees over the last 25 years, and during that time period, the DOJ has never once proven an actual pattern or practice. What they do is they'll do a secret study, and they'll produce findings that will claim that there's a pattern or practice, but they've never actually proven it in court.
So give us the good, the bad, and the ugly on consent decrees.
Well, my experience is that it's a very closed process. For all the talk about openness and transparency, DOJ is the least transparent organization that I've ever worked with. They won't tell you anything, and they'll do everything behind closed doors and in secret. And then it won't be until they've actually reached their conclusions that they will tell you in their findings letter. And then they'll say, you have no choice but to do a consent decree. We're not willing to negotiate. We're not willing to explain our findings. And when the DOJ for Seattle, they conducted a 9-month investigation where they collected thousands of documents from SPD, Seattle PD, and we were just an open book, right? We would give them anything they asked for, answered any question, made any personnel available to them to interview, and so they conducted this investigation, and they had what they called experts looking at the data. And then late one night in December, they summoned the mayor and the police chief and the command staff to the U.S. Attorney's office. And they said that the next morning they were going to have a press conference and issue their findings. And their findings were that 20% of all of the use of force incidents in Seattle PD were excessive or unnecessary and unconstitutional. And we said that's not possible. We would know if 20% of our uses of force were unconstitutional, because we do a thorough review of each use of force incident. And so he said, can you tell us which cases you've identified as being unconstitutional? And they refused. They said, no, we won't tell you anything. You just have to do the consent decree. So this led to about a 6-month period of intense negotiations between DOJ and the mayor's office and the police department. And ultimately it came down to a political decision where you had the Seattle City Council, the Seattle City Attorney, who's separately elected, a lot of community groups, and coming down on the side of wanting a consent decree, and the mayor and the police chief basically saying, well, we don't think we should. But ultimately, the mayor agreed to do the consent decree, and it's cost over $100 million over the last 10 years. It has resulted in several turnovers of command staffs. So you've lost all of the institutional knowledge in the department. Um, and it created a disaster during the George Floyd protests, where you had the police department abandoning an entire precinct, and an entire neighborhood um, wouldn't get police services, and was occupied by the protesters. And there were so many people who were involved in managing the department and telling the department what they should or shouldn't do during those protests, that they ended up without any leadership, and just I don't know of any police department in the country that's ever abandoned an entire precinct and neighborhood um, for a month or more. So it's I mean, a lot of problems, but typically what I see in DOJ consent decrees is that I know we probably don't want to talk about politics, but they're 90% political and 10% based on some kind of evidentiary finding. And that includes who the DOJ decides to investigate, because they have very limited resources, and you have 18,000 law enforcement agencies, and they've never revealed what are their criteria for investigating an agency. And right now they're investigating Minneapolis, Phoenix, and Louisville. And obviously these are all agencies that have had some high profile incidents, but there are a lot of agencies and a lot of smaller agencies that may have serious problems that the DOJ will never look at, because there's no political advantage or interest in going after these smaller agencies.
So, could a consent decree provide any value? And if yes, what would have to change? What do you think are the key factors that would go into making a worthwhile and sustainable consent decree? Or would you say never do one?
No, I think consent decrees do have a role, and they could provide value if a department had problems and they refused to change. So in Seattle, when the Department of Justice said you have a pattern or practice of unconstitutional uses of force, our response was, we will do whatever you want us to do. If you want us to implement new policies, we'll do that. You want us to do new training, we will do that. We were willing to make whatever changes they said were necessary. And what they said is, no, we have to force you to do it. Unless we force you to do it, it won't work. And so again, it's this political. They wanted to get credit for forcing the department to make these reforms. But if you did have a department that had problems, identified problems, and the chief or the command staff or the mayor, they said, look, go away. We don't think we have any problems. We're not going to make any changes. And then it makes sense for the DOJ to go after and say, all right, we since you're unwilling to make any reforms on your own, we're going to have to force you into this consent decree. But even then, DOJ needs to reform their own practices in order to effectively implement reforms. None of the DOJ reforms are evidence-based. They have no data. They have no information on what is a good use of force policy, what is effective use of force training. They don't know. They make it up as they go along. And so until we have those evidence-based practices in place, and for example, we asked the DOJ, we said, what's a model policy for use of force that you would recommend? And they said, well, there isn't one. We have to tailor make this for your agency, and we have to go through this multi-year process to develop the best use of force for your agency, which is crazy, because I mean, use of force is use of force, and there may be some tweaks depending on state law and your own, but I mean, everybody's governed by the Graham v. Connor standards, and everybody can see something like a George Floyd case. You don't have to have a special policy or anything to know that was an unlawful use of force practice and criminal. And so there are certain things that should be universal in terms of your policies and your training. But there are no best practices right now for use of force because there's no evidence.
And so let's talk about the evidence. What do you think needs to be collected by whom and how? And
yeah, one of the big problems now is obviously that there is no data on use of force incidents. So there are some local and state data collection programs, and they're all pretty limited, and they're not designed for analysis or research. There was a lot of hope put into the FBI data collection program that started in 2019, and the FBI is collected data now from more than 7,000 law enforcement agencies around the country, but they're only collecting data on deadly force, so the discharge of a firearm or any other force that results in a death or serious bodily injury. So that's probably 2 or 3% of all the actual uses of force, physical force, and weapons that are used. So it's a pretty small percentage. But right now there's no data. And so the FBI started collecting this in 2019. Presumably they have a lot of information from these 7,000 agencies, and yet the FBI refuses to release any data. And they say that they have to have 60% of agencies participating before they'll release any data. And then when they do, they're not going to release any data on individual agencies. They're only going to release aggregate data at the state level and the national level. So all these groups and individuals and people that want transparency, they want to know what's happening with their local police department. And the FBI isn't going to tell anybody anything about that. It's only state and national level. So even if the FBI was releasing data, people would be very disappointed with the results, because you don't know what's happening with your local department. And because of this lack of data, the media and other activist groups have stepped into the void, and they have started collecting data on their own. So the most comprehensive data that we have now on deadly force in the United States comes from the Washington Post, because they started collecting data through crowdsourcing, media reports, public records requests. And so a media outlet has more data than the federal government or any local government about deadly force and it's only deaths. I mean, they're not even counting deadly force. It's only force that results in a death. And then you have other organizations like fatalencounters.org and Mapping Police Violence, that have are private advocacy groups that have expanded that data collection somewhat. But it's crazy to think that you have the FBI that is responsible for collecting UCR data, NIBRS data, a database on law enforcement officers who are killed or assaulted, and all of that data they make available online, but not deadly force data that they are collecting, and that they have, and they refuse to release it.
So Bob,
Is the challenge that they just don't know how to analyze or interpret it?
Well, the one of the interesting things is that this should be public record, right? Any data like this is not CJIS information they're collecting, the criminal justice information system. So this is the CJIS information. If you have criminal history records and personally identifiable information, that information is not publicly available. The FBI database on deadly force does not include any CJIS information. So there's no exemptions to a Freedom of Information Act request. It all should be made public. But the FBI has internal rules that they impose on themselves, which says we're not going to release any data until we get to 60% compliance. And even then, we're only going to release it at a state or national level. So these are restrictions that they're imposing on themselves. And I actually submitted a FOIA request last month, and I said, just give me all the data. You have data from 7,000 agencies that you've collected. I want to get the raw data. And I got a response back from the FBI where they sent me a 5-page PDF that had the list of data elements that they collect, but no data. So, and they said, this is responsive to your request and we're closing your request. So I posted that on LinkedIn, and I had all these people that used to work for the FBI saying, this is not right. They can't just blow you off like this. But my thing isn't FOIA requests, and I'm not going to, start a lawsuit or anything against the FBI, but they should be turning over this data that they have, and it's really a detriment to society to have all this data that they've collected and refuse to release it. Because if we had that data, even if it wasn't for all the agencies, we could start comparing the FBI data with the data from the Washington Post and these other agencies and see how accurate their databases are. So I think it's not so much a function of they don't know. I think the FBI does know what to do with the data. They just are refusing to do anything with it, which doesn't
So
make sense to me, because why do it in the first place?
so Bob, we've got we've got a number of listeners, many of them personal acquaintances and friends, that are police executives today. They may even be police chiefs or assistant chiefs, and one of them calls us up and says, "Hey, you had this guy on, this guy Bob Scales. He was talking about data, use of force data. Um, could you give us Bob's phone number? And I want to give him a call. I want to ask Bob, hey, I'm interested as a police chief in doing the right thing here. And you keep talking about data. Well, what should I be collecting? What kind of data should I install a process for that I can start collecting, to start amassing, to get to a point where we can determine and analyze whether we have an issue or not? What would you tell them?"
Yeah, well, it's really interesting because we started our company in 2015, and nobody knew who we were or anything. And so I went to a lot of different conferences around the country, including IACP, and did presentations and had a booth, and invariably the response I would get from police executives was, um, I already know what's happening in my department. I don't need a data system to tell me that, and so I'm not going to spend the time or the money to create these, data analysis and so forth. And we can just do it internally ourselves. And a lot of departments are looking at their own data. Um, the challenge is that if you don't collect and analyze and provide data to the public, someone else will. And that's what's happening with these different, the Washington Post and these other crowdsourcing sites, is they'll do public records requests, and they'll get all these records from the department, and then they will analyze the data. And this happens all the time, and you're always seeing media reports of so and so did this study of this department and that study of that department, and they'll always come up with their own spin on what the data means, particularly for racial disparity analysis. And then the department's left saying, well, that's not right, we don't think that's right. But they haven't done their own internal evaluation and collection of the data to be able to present an accurate picture of what's going on. So when we start working with an agency, we have different data systems that we've developed, and the biggest one we have is our force analysis system. And so when we start working with an agency, there's no agency that currently collects all the data that we use for our system. We use over 150 different data fields on each use of force incident to really understand exactly what happened when the officer arrived, what happened during the force incident, what happened after the force incident, and look at things at the incident level, the subject level, and the officer level. No agency right now is collecting and analyzing all of that data. But all of that information exists in the incident reports and the officer narrative statements. So when an officer arrives on the scene, if they end up using force in an incident, they're going to document everything about that incident, because they know they have to be able to, there's going to be an investigation, there may be a lawsuit, there may be a complaint. They know exactly what they have to put in their report and how much detail. So we have this wealth of information, but it's in an officer's narrative statement. So what we do is we review those statements, and we have a coding process that we've developed. And so we review each use of force incident, we pull out all these data variables, and then we have different legal algorithms that we run them through. And so then we give dashboards back to the department. So instead of reviewing thousands of use of force incident reports, they have a dashboard that they can do their own queries, and they can look at different types of force and force factors and force justifications and different risk areas. And they can start to evaluate their policies and training and individual officer practices. And you don't have to, necessarily get an IT system to do that. And a lot of agencies do their own. They'll have crime analysts or others within the department that will look at the data. The challenge is that you really have to be. It has to be comprehensive. I mean, you really have to. It's not enough just to collect. How many times did we use a taser last year? A lot of departments just collect basic. How many times did things happen? But you have to go deeper in order to understand the use of force. You really have to go deeper into the analysis and look at how and why officers are using force. You also have to look at subject behavior, because whether an officer uses force or not will depend on what the subject does. Is the subject compliant? Are they threatening the officer? Are they assaulting the officer? Are they fleeing from the officer? So many departments collect data on what the officer does, but you have to collect data on what the subject does as well to understand what's happening.
Excellent point. Excellent point that often gets overlooked, especially in today's day and age. What's the name of your company?
Police Strategies.
And before we end, I'm sure Ray will ask you how people could get a hold of you. But go ahead, Ray. You have one?
I do. So after you guys crunch this data, what do you give back to the police executive, the agency? Do you give them an assessment of what happened? Do you give them strategy? Do you give them avenues for training for corrective measures?
Yeah. So right now there are a lot of consultants that will come into a department and they'll review their policies, they'll review their training, they'll look at their procedures, and they'll interview a lot of folks, and they'll typically come up with 100 recommendations for how the department can improve. And all of those recommendations are going to be based on the consultant's opinion. They're not going to be based on data. We're very different. So we come in and we look at the data, and our goal is to provide the data, the information back to the agency so that they can make those decisions, so that they can query the data, they can ask the questions about the data, and they can make their own decisions about policies and training, and not based on our opinion of it. And so our focus is, so they'll give us the data and the reports and so forth. And what we provide is we give them a written report that summarizes what the data and trends and patterns show. And then we give them 2 series of dashboards, well, actually 3 series of dashboards. So the first dashboard series is sort of internal dashboards where a department can drill down into individual officers and individual incidents and do all those comparative data. The second dashboard system is comparative interagency comparative dashboard. So because we're collecting data from departments and analyzing it and collecting it and standardizing the coding, so every agency is looked at in exactly the same way. So it doesn't matter the size or the location of the agency, type of agency, we're looking at use of force exactly the same way. So because we're standardizing the coding, we can start to make meaningful interagency comparisons. So you can compare. Right now we have just about 100 agencies in the system from 8 states, and even though it's a relatively small sample, you can get a sense of how does your agency's force practices compare with other agencies? How do officer injury rates and subject injury rates compare to other agencies? And we've already found we've done a few peer-reviewed journal articles with different academic institutions, and the first one we did was in Police Quarterly, and we looked at regional differences in use of force practices. And most of the agencies we have now are in Washington State, California, and Wisconsin. And so what we found was that in Washington State, there's a heavy reliance on tasers. In California, there's a heavy reliance on strikes and batons. In Wisconsin, it's almost all low-level physical force. They almost never use any intermediate weapons, and all the force
Wow.
they use is pretty low. And we think that's a function of state
Training?
training. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's
Yep.
just, and it's also a function of equipment that may be available. Some agencies in California don't have tasers, so obviously they wouldn't have a high taser rate. But it looks like the state training academy is probably a major driver of use of force practices in different states. Um, And then the third series of dashboards we present are public dashboards. So this is more aggregated data, but if an agency wants to provide some of their data available to the public, where the public can actually query the data themselves, then we do that as well. And those have proved to be very popular. We get a lot of hits and views on those dashboards, and a lot of community engagement and feedback. And it really does help to provide, even though it might not change people's minds, if they already have a strong opinion of the police, probably seeing the data isn't going to change their minds, but at least we'll have accurate and comprehensive data. So when issues come up, we can have a data informed discussion, even if there's not agreement amongst the parties.
So 10 or 20 seconds on somebody's cell phone video of an incident or a piece of an incident, one single incident that makes it 6 o'clock news, can be all the pattern and practice some people think they need to say that this department is doing something wrong. So I would think that it would behoove any police chief to get ahead of this and to start collecting data, whether they use your company or a company like it or whatever, or understand what data they need to collect. Because why wait until one incident begins to define your department when you could start collecting data today and hopefully have accumulated a couple of years worth of data so that you have a response and you can show people and be transparent to what you're doing or not doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, basically, the public opinion on police use of force is being shaped by less than 1% of all the force that occurs.
Exactly.
And obviously, it's the most extreme, examples that people are seeing. So when you talk about police use of force, people immediately goes to their mind is deadly force, and then what also comes to mind are those acts of unjustified force, like George Floyd. And what many people do not understand is that use of force is a necessary component of policing. You could
Absolutely.
not do your job as a police officer if you could not use force, because there are always going to be some suspects that will not comply. And so if you're dealing with a situation and the subject is fleeing or resisting or threatening, the officer or someone else, then you have to have the ability to use some level of force to either stop the threat or control or bring the subject into custody. And what we've found is that about 4% of arrests result in some type of force. And so that means that 96% of the time, when officers are arresting a subject, they're able to do it without any force. They're able to gain compliance without the use of any force at all, which is a pretty high percentage when you think about what you're dealing with. And people are being forcibly or taken in involuntary custody for some type of offense. And so what this means too is that if your officers are making more arrests, your uses of force are going to go up. I guarantee you. And when use of force goes down, that's generally when officers are pulling back. And typically what we see when a consent decree happens, or when there's a lot of scrutiny placed on a police department after some high profile incident, officers may pull back and they may be less proactive and they may not be making as many arrests, particularly for low level offenses. And so what happens when a consent decree starts is that use of force goes down. And the DOJ will say, "Isn't this great? Our consent decree is already working. We haven't even started, and it's already working." But what's happening is that officers are disengaging, being less proactive, making fewer arrests, and that means uses of force are going down.
And criminal impunity is going up in many cases.
Exactly. So if suspects realize that, hey, if I commit a crime and officers are reluctant and I flee and officers are reluctant to chase me or either on foot or a vehicle pursuit, then I'm gonna run away every time. Why would I ever stop, when an officer tells me to stop?
Exactly. And in some places, I think that's where we're headed. Criminal
Hey,
impunity.
Bob, we've spoke a lot tonight about data and analysis. Have you found in your experiences that oftentimes many police executives, since they didn't really come from that world of data analysis, that uh, it takes a little bit of an education or informing them on the value of data and analysis?
It's a lot easier now than it was, 7 years ago. Um, because I think that with there's so much scrutiny and so much intensity around policing issues, uh, and there's also so much misinformation out there about policing that I think police executives are realizing now that there's no benefit to a department in keeping the data to themselves, and there's immense benefit in sharing as much information as they can with the public and the media. um, and so yeah, it's like night and day for our business. I mean we're extremely busy now because people have law enforcement's really realized that this is a really good. I mean we need to get this information out there because people don't understand what we're doing.
So one other question I have is obviously the title of our podcast is Relentless Follow Up. Um, how do you inspire your police executives to relentlessly follow up on the data, both the current data that you're providing them, and then into the future, whether you're still there or not, or if your contract is ended?
Right. Well, I think that the main goal of what we do is to, not sort of impose our judgment on a department or give them a bunch of recommendations for what we think would be good, but to give the department itself the tools, and the data and the information that they can use it to really make good decisions and make good policies and do good training, and not only that, but be able to measure the impacts. So if you implement a new policy and you have 5 years of historical use of force data, and I implemented this policy on January 1st, 2022, then you can start looking at, well, what happened after I implemented that policy compared to before? And am I seeing the results that I want to see, or is it having some unintended impacts? And so you can use the system to evaluate the effectiveness of any reform that you put into place. So if you do de-escalation training for all your officers, I would want to know as an executive, is that working? I'm putting my officers through 40 hours of crisis intervention training, and spending all this money, millions of dollars. Is it having an impact? And is it having the impact that I want it to have? And if you can start to show actual results for some of these reforms that you're putting into place, then that's going to be great for an executive, for his elected officials when budget time comes around. It's going to be great for the public to show that, hey, we're implementing these reforms, and look at what changes have happened. So, but without the data, you just check the box. I did the training. I did this. I did that. Um, so it really, I think executives are starting to really understand. We don't have any department that pays us for our services that doesn't use the dashboards that we give them.
Right.
That would be, and so in many ways our clients are sort of self-selecting. I mean, we tend to get the more progressive chiefs and sheriffs that really want this information, because none of it's being forced on them. They have to choose us and pay for it.
You know, it's obvious. It's obvious. I know it's obvious to me, and I know it's obvious to Ray that there's a th- there's a definite return on investment. This is an investment, and there's definitely we could see a number of areas where there would be a significant return on that investment. Having said that, is this something that's initially affordable for a police department to engage your company?
Yeah, so we that's another big problem with a lot of these sort of IT systems that may be on the market, like early warning systems. They can be pretty expensive. I'm not a proponent of any early warning system, because I don't think there's any IT system that can predict the future or predict future misconduct. But that is a stumbling block for a lot of these IT systems. But because we're not really an IT system, we're more of a data analytics service. Um, our sort of pricing model is based on the number of use of force incidents your department has. So if you're a small department, and you have 10 uses of force a year, the system is very inexpensive because our costs are driven by the number of cases that we actually have to review and enter the data. So at least, and then obviously the larger the department, we just started a project with Dallas PD, and they're the largest agency we're working with now, and they have thousands of cases a year. So obviously their system is going to be more expensive than a more smaller department. But we've never had a situation where if an agency wants our system where they couldn't afford it.
And this is something that's, I would think you and your company are scalable to be able to take on everything from small independent clients to large departments like Dallas.
Well, yes and no. So one of the big challenges that we have is just that scalability. So Dallas is a real challenge because we have to manually review and code thousands of use of force reports a year. For smaller agencies, obviously that's not a problem, but for the larger agencies, it's more challenging. So one of the things that we're working on now with Seattle University is a proposal to build a statewide data collection program for Washington State. The legislature passed Senate Bill 5259 last year that calls for the creation of a statewide data collection project, and it's going to be housed at a university in Washington State. So there's going to be an RFP that will be issued soon. And as part of that project, we'll have the historical data collection coming from our manual coding process because it's the only way to get the historical data. But moving forward, the only way, like in Washington State, we estimate there's going to be about 15,000 incidents a year. So that's a lot of incidents to manually code. So we're going to have an option available where agencies and officers can enter the data directly into the system, because the data collection, I mean, and even though it sounds like a lot, 150 different data fields, it's not like you're entering 150 different data fields on every incident. That's the maximum number possible. So if all you do is use your taser and nothing else, then you don't have to worry about all the other physical and other weapons. And so with an officer data entry system, we think you can enter the data, in 2 or 3 minutes. And because use of force is relatively rare, officers might only have to enter data 2 or 3 times a year. So it's not a huge time issue for officers. And because we'd be getting the data directly from the officers right after the incident, that would enable us to update the dashboards in real time. So whereas now we have to, we generally update them annually, and we have to do a manual coding process, which can take several weeks. So in the long term, our goal is to move to this officer data entry system, and then we can, then we're totally scalable, and then we can also reduce the cost. That would dramatically reduce the cost of the system because we're not doing any of the manual coding.
If you're focusing on the information component, they're focusing on the physical component, actually entering the data. Are there federal grants available to police departments for this type of data collection?
We have had some departments that have purchased our initial system through grants. I don't think there are any sort of special sort of grants that are earmarked specifically for this kind of system. They're more general, burn grants or something like that.
Are you listening, NIJ? Are you listening?
Yeah, if I was selling body cameras, I'd have it made. There's plenty of grants for that. But yeah, I mean, it should be. I think it should be a bigger priority for federal and state funding, and that's why the Washington State project is so great, because the legislature, fully funded that project. And so it's there'll be no cost to the law enforcement agencies themselves in participating, and we have strong support from both the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs and the Fraternal Order of Police on this. I mean, they have seen the value of data collection, so they were both. All law enforcement agencies were totally in support of the legislation, and they all want this data and information. So we're going to have great cooperation and participation from all the 274 agencies in Washington State.
Well, we're gonna definitely get you back on to follow up on that. I mean, after all, relentless follow-ups in our name here.
Yeah, yeah, that'd be great.
Hey Bob, I have one final question, and it's gonna spin off of something that Pete taught me a long time ago when I first met him when I was on the job trying to implement a new program, new initiatives, and it was that regardless of the program or initiative, it fundamentally comes down to people, processes, and technology. So in your experience as it relates to police reform, particularly as we talked about data and analysis, what's the toughest challenge? Is it the people? Is it the processes in terms of policies and procedures, or is it the right technologies?
It's an interesting question. Certainly, the technology is not a problem, right? We can do pretty much anything with data analysis right now. I mean, whereas dashboards or statistical packages. I mean, that's easy. I think there's less and less obstacles in terms of funding and interest from both elected officials as well as police executives. I mean, everybody wants the data now. The biggest challenge, I think, is explaining the data because people have this preconceived notion of what's going on. And when the data doesn't support that, they tend to reject the data. And this is particularly true with racial disparity studies, um, and that typically look at some police activity, stops, arrests, uses of force compared to the population. And when you do that, you'll always see large disparities for usually for Native Americans and African Americans, and then you see underrepresentation for Asian Americans. So the typical narrative is that these disparities for either Black, Hispanic, or Native Americans are due to officer bias. And I'm absolutely sure that officer bias does play a role at some level, but not to the level that most people think, and that those disparities are driven primarily by reported crimes. And when you look at NIBR's data on reported crimes, you see similar percentages to stops and arrests and uses of force, which is what you would expect, because if 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 90% of your calls that are coming in are about robberies in a particular neighborhood, then that's where your police resources are going to be focused, and that's where your officers are going to be looking for that kind of activity. And so much of policing is driven by calls for service and by what the community is asking the police to do. And within that, that's where you see the significant disparities with the population.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Bob, I can't thank you enough for this conversation. Pete, you have anything else?
Other than to say that, quote Sergeant Joe Friday from Dragnet years ago. I don't know how old you are,
I
Bob.
remember. I remember that. I
Okay.
am
Well,
that old.
anyway, you know what? Just the facts, ma'am. Just the facts, and the facts today are in the data. And I think that you've made the case. I'm a believer. I think it behooves any police chief today, in the environment that we're working in today, to get ahead of this game and start collecting the data and be transparent with it and let the data lead and follow wherever it goes.
Very true. Hey, Bob, so where could folks find you at? I know you said that at one time you were not into social media, but now you are. So where can they
Only
find you
LinkedIn.
on
I don't. I
social?
don't do. I don't
Okay.
do TikTok or Instagram or anything like that. I'm
No
I'm a, I'm a
TikTok.
LinkedIn
Yeah.
guy,
Yeah.
professional social media.
So where can they find you on LinkedIn as well as you have a company website too?
Sure. I mean, my name, Bob Scales. You can find me on LinkedIn or Police Strategies, and then our website is policestrategies.com.
Well, thank you.
Good
Do you
deal.
have do you have anything for us or do we cover it all?
No, it was great. I really enjoyed it. I mean, I never get tired, as you know, if you looked at my LinkedIn and all my posts, I never get tired about talking about this.
Yeah, you're
and
definitely passionate. Yep.
Yeah, and what's really exciting is that things are starting to change, and I think things have gone on so long, in the absence of data, and people are getting so frustrated with everything that it's time. I mean, it's like, if we want to create any meaningful change, if we really want to understand what's going on, we have to have the data. And I think people are starting to realize that. So it's an exciting time.
Well, the police are the community of the police, and they have to